Rome didn't collapse because barbarian armies overran its borders. It collapsed because its money did. For centuries, the Roman Empire was owned just a political power. It was the world's economic center. Its coinage, the silver denarius, was more than money. It was trust. From the bustling markets of Alexandria to the ports of Britannia, the denarius was as good as gold. It unified a vast and diverse empire under one financial system. It was Rome's signature, stamped in silver. The strength of the empire, however, was also its curse. Expansion demanded money, endless amounts of it. Soldiers needed pay. Roads and aqueducts needed maintenance. Grain had to be imported to feed millions. Lavish spectacles and public games were expected to keep the citizens entertained. And emperors constantly vying for favor needed to spend more than their predecessors. But wealth, even in Rome, had limits. Taxing the population further risked revolt. Borrowing was limited, so emperors reached for the easiest, most tempting solution. They began devaluing their money. The logic was simple. If you could reduce the amount of silver in each coin, you could mint more coins from the same supply of silver. More coins meant more spending power for the state. It was, at first glance, a stroke of genius. The denarius, once almost pure silver, slowly began to change. A slight reduction here, a subtle alloy there. Coins still looked the same, and for a while, no one noticed. But the illusion couldn't last forever. Within a century, the denarius had lost much of its silver content. By the time of Emperor Caracalla, in the early 3rd century, the new coin, the Antoninianus, contained less than 50% silver. A few decades later, that number fell below 5%. Eventually, the coins were little more than bronze discs coated with a whisper of silver. To the common Roman, the difference was clear. Prices rose sharply. Merchants demanded more coins for the same goods. Soldiers, once loyal for pay, now demanded higher wages to compensate for worthless money. Inflation spiraled, and the entire economy began to convulse. The empire responded with confusion and control. Officials blamed merchants for greed, not realizing that the currency itself was the problem. Emperor Diocletian eventually issued his famous edict on maximum prices in 301 CE, fixing the price of goods and the wages of workers by law. Anyone who disobeyed could face death. But markets don't obey decrees. The result was predictable. Goods vanished from legal markets, and black markets thrived. Farmers hid their grain. Traders stopped trading. The flow of commerce, which had once linked the empire together, slowed to a crawl. The Roman economy began to disintegrate from within. Trust, the invisible glue that holds a monetary system together, was gone, and when money collapses, everything that depends on it begins to unravel too. Rome's decline wasn't sudden. It wasn't the thunderous fall of a single day. It was a slow, creeping rot. One coin, one decree, one illusion at a time. By the time the invaders came, the empire was already hollowed out. The walls still stood, but the foundation had dissolved. Rome didn't die in battle. It starved itself to death with bad money. Every civilization is built on trust, not just in leaders, laws, or armies, but in its money. Money is the most universal contract a society makes with itself. It's a promise that value given today will still mean something tomorrow. Rome broke that promise. When the emperors began debasing the denarius, they weren't just diluting silver. They were eroding confidence. People realized their coins no longer represented the same value they once did. Inflation took root, and soon it became unstoppable. Historians call the 3rd century CE the crisis of the 3rd century. It was a period of unrelenting chaos, civil wars, invasions, assassinations, and economic collapse. The currency crisis was at the heart of it. The state kept producing more and more worthless coins to cover its debts and pay its armies. The more coins they minted, the less each was worth. The effects were catastrophic. As inflation raged, People stopped trusting imperial money altogether. Soldiers demanded to be paid in goods, grain, oil, wine, or even land instead of coins. Local economies reverted to barter. The empire's once complex trade networks disintegrated into isolated, self-sufficient communities. Urban centers shrank. Farmers stopped bringing produce to the cities because city money couldn't buy anything real. It wasn't just an economic breakdown. It was a social breakdown. Rome's citizens lost faith in their institutions. Tax collection became impossible because the taxes themselves were meaningless. Officials extorted payments in kind. The army, once the proud guardian of the empire, became a mercenary force, selling its loyalty to whoever could pay in something real. And as trust in money disappeared, so did trust in government. Between 235 and 284 CE, more than 20 emperors came and went, most of them killed by rivals or their own troops. Each new ruler promised stability, but each inherited an economy that no longer functioned. Inflation wasn't just destroying prices, it was destroying legitimacy. Diocletian's reforms, including his wage and price controls, were desperate attempts to force the economy back into order. But price controls can't fix a broken currency. You can threaten merchants, but you can't command confidence. The black market thrived, and the official market died. Constantine's introduction of the gold solidus in the 4th century temporarily restored stability for the wealthy, but it was too late for the masses. The Roman economy had already fractured beyond repair. Trade, once the empire's lifeblood, had become dangerous and uncertain. Commerce shrank, roads fell into disuse, and the once bustling markets of Rome grew quiet. By the time the Visigoths sacked Rome in 410 CE, the empire had been economically dead for generations. The physical fall of the city was only the final act in a much longer collapse, the inevitable consequence of a century of monetary decay. Rome's story shows that inflation isn't just a financial problem, it's a civilizational disease. Once trust in money is lost, all other forms of trust soon follow. Rome's tragedy didn't end with its ruins. It set a pattern, one that history has repeated again and again. After Rome came the same story, dressed in new clothes, the hyperinflation of Weimar Germany in the 1920s, the paper money collapse of Zimbabwe in the 2000s, the implosion of the Venezuelan bolivar in our own century. Each time, governments faced debt, war, or crisis. Each time, they reached for the same tool, printing more money to cover the gap. And each time, the result was the same: the slow death of purchasing power, the erosion of savings, and the destruction of trust. Rome's emperors had their mints. Modern governments have central banks. The process is more sophisticated, but the principle hasn't changed. When a society creates more money than real value, it's borrowing from its own future, and the bill always comes due. In Rome's time, the debasement was visible. The silver disappeared from the coin. Today, it's invisible. The currency remains the same color, the same size, the same name, but its value quietly erodes through inflation. The system depends on confidence, the belief that tomorrow's money will still buy what it buys today. When that belief wavers, the entire economy trembles. The Romans didn't think they were destroying their empire. They thought they were saving it. Every act of debasement was justified as a temporary measure, a way to fund an army, fix a crisis, or calm unrest. But temporary measures have a way of becoming permanent. And once a society normalizes inflation, it loses the ability to tell the truth about value. That's the hidden danger of all fiat systems. They rest not on substance, but on faith. And faith, once broken, is almost impossible to restore. Today, global debt is at record highs. Central banks create new money digitally with a few keystrokes. Inflation, once dismissed as a relic of the past, has returned to public consciousness. The same forces that hollowed out Rome's denarius now gnaw at the world's fiat currencies. History's lesson is simple but harsh. You cannot print prosperity. You cannot debase your way to stability. Every empire that has tried eventually learned the same lesson Rome did: when money dies, everything dies with it. The fall of the Roman currency wasn't just an economic failure. It was a moral one. It revealed what happens when a society trades honesty for convenience, when leaders choose illusion over truth, and when people stop asking what their money is really worth. The most important takeaway from Rome's collapse is this: real wealth doesn't depend on governments or mints. It depends on scarcity, integrity, and productivity, on assets and skills that inflation can erode. Land, hard commodities, craftsmanship, innovation, these have always outlasted empires and their currencies. The Romans built monuments that still stand today, but their money turned to dust. Ours will too, if we forget the lessons they left behind. History doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. Rome's story isn't a warning from the past. It's a mirror held up to the present. Because when a civilization forgets what gives money its value, it begins to decay quietly, invisibly, and inevitably. Rome's collapse wasn't unique. It was the first chapter in a book we're still writing today. If this gives you a new perspective, subscribe to Capital Chronicles. Because history doesn't repeat, but if you don't understand it, it will crush you all the same.